It is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Ellen Lewis, who Ellen and I just touched base and realized that we did things in the opposite way in life. I was a therapist and later in life became a rabbi, and Ellen did exactly the opposite. She was a congregational rabbi and now is a practicing clinical psychotherapist. She has served congregations in Dallas, Texas, New Jersey, Washington, and she works with rabbis and cantors in therapy and professional supervision to develop the emotional resiliency that's required in this type of work. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the need for that kind of resiliency. And Rabbi Jeff Brown was ordained at HUC in 2005, and he served at Temple Solel in San Diego from 2005 to 2012, and he is now the rabbi at the Scarsdale Synagogue, Temple Tremont at Emmanuel. And I feel like there is a real connection to the talk that we heard from Dan and Barak to this discussion that we're going to have now. And the connection that I see is that the work of rabbi is actually a lot more complex than anything that we maybe had already discussed this morning. And I think that both Rabbi Jeff and Rabbi Ellen will help us to understand probably something that all of us who are rabbis in this room know, that the Rabbinic is filled with challenges, and those challenges and the projections and the transference that can happen as rabbis, we might not have been prepared for that in school, and then we get out in the field and we have to make both difficult decisions, and we have to protect ourselves as professionals with skills that perhaps rabbinical school introduced us to and perhaps did not introduce us to. And I think that in this discussion we're really going to be talking about some of those fine points of what we need to be able to do as rabbi that perhaps some other professionals might not necessarily need to interact with. So I turn to Ellen first, and then I've got some questions to ask both of you as well.
Okay, thanks, Fredi. I'm assuming that most people have not had a chance to read the book yet, as I understand it. And what I don't want to do is summarize the chapter, particularly because Chaim warned me against it. And when I talked to Steve Krause, he said, don't make it all about Barry Freundel. So what I'm going to do then is to try and fill in a simple backstory on my part and then expand on some of the ideas that are in the chapter. Early in my rabbinic career, I was lucky enough to fall into a small supervision group that was run by a modern psychoanalytic institute. I was the only rabbi in that group. There were social workers, there were nurses, there were teachers, and I sat mute for the first 3 sessions of the group. I literally felt like I had lockjaw because everybody else was talking comfortably about their cases, and I felt like I couldn't talk about my congregants, even though that was partly why I was there. And I think I felt like that for 2 reasons, well, for a few. One was that I didn't know how to. I didn't know it was okay to. And maybe there was even a sense of personal failure on my part because I had really come out of school with the idea that I should just know how to deal with these problems and not have to talk to anybody or get any help. So I sat for 3 weeks, and then a week before Rosh Hashanah, a 17-year-old girl in my congregation collapsed in gym class and died. And I, luckily, had a place to talk, because if any of you have been through things like that, you know it's kind of indescribable. And for me, what the group allowed was that I had a place to tolerate my feelings, and then I could go back and help this family tolerate their feelings. When I started in this group, I never intended to become an analyst, but the power of that emotional education grabbed me, and it was so helpful to my rabbinate that then I just kept going in my training. That group was my first exposure to what I would call two basic questions. The two basic questions of the rabbinate, which I would call what's me and what's not me. I think that those are crucial no matter what setting you function in, particularly in congregational life. And what I'd like to do is to start to talk about the preventive ways to understand those questions rather than focusing on the extreme cases of rabbis who don't and who then commit horrific acts. My premise is if the rabbinate is an emotionally stimulating place, and that we as rabbis are always responsible for managing our own feelings and for reacting appropriately. And that the only way to do that is to develop emotional resiliency. That is, if we want to both enjoy our work and to survive the challenges of the work. And the way you develop emotional resiliency is to be talking, both in therapy and in professional supervision, through that 60-year educational period that we call the rabbinate, from seminary training and forever. So what do I mean by emotionally stimulating, and how it is that you manage that and work it through? I imagine a lot of you know this without my saying it, but let me offer a few examples of conversations I've had recently with some colleagues. The first one is about a rabbi who had just met with her administrator, and she wonders why she has such a difficult relationship with this administrator. She assumes that somehow the administrator is pushing old buttons in her and touching on some feelings that she, as the rabbi, is not aware of. We talk about what the feelings are. She says she feels agitated and anxious when she sits with this person. And did she feel that way before she met with her? No. And after the administrator left the room, did she still have those feelings? No. And how did the other staff members react to this administrator? Also agitated and anxious. So the more she's talking, the more she says, oh, maybe this isn't about me. Maybe this is actually about something that this administrator is inducing in the people around her. So in that case, it's a simple example, but asking what's me and what's not me, let the rabbi step back, understand the situation better, and then be able to make a plan for how to strategize working with the administrator. Another conversation with a rabbi who was sitting with a family for a funeral intake. The rabbi feels very sad, understandably, as he's sitting with the family. The family leaves. The rabbi feels sad for the rest of the day. Wakes up the next morning, still sad. A couple of days later, still sad. And in the process of talking about this, he realizes that the sadness of the family had in fact triggered something in him that actually had nothing to do with this family, but had to do with something unresolved in him. So that in that case, asking what's my feeling and what's their feeling allowed him to understand this is more about him, and then allowed him to make a plan on how to go forward. Now a third scenario, which gets a little bit closer to the topic of the chapter. The rabbi is working with a bar mitzvah family, and each time she meets with the family, she feels very connected to the father. In fact, she describes it as feeling tingly. She looks forward to the meetings with the family. She's dreading the time when this bar mitzvah is over, because this is not a man who comes to services. She's wondering if he feels the same way about her, and what would she do if he asked her to lunch. would she go? Or would it be so terrible if she asked him to lunch? So you can see here there's a slippery slope moving from the first example to this example, but the basic questions are the same, which is who's having what feelings here? Is the father of the bar mitzvah attracted to her, or does he have a positive transference to her? Is she sexually attracted to him? Is this a fantasy on her part, on his part? How are things going in her marriage? Is she feeling appreciated and admired and desirable? So again, the questions are what's me and what's not me, because if she can't make that distinction in the situation and instead she acts on her impulses, she might take an action that she will later regret. And then you could ask the question, what if all these interactions happen in the same day? Because those of us who have been in the pulpit rabbinate know that you can have a day like that. In fact, I was talking to somebody this week and I asked her if I could repeat for you what she described as her day last Friday. She said first two women came to see her. They were worried about a third woman who's a member of the congregation. They think she might be the victim of domestic abuse. And they want her as the rabbi to intervene. Then the phone rings. The congregant on the other end wants to complain to her about her sermon topic that she put up on the Facebook page, because she likes to do that as a teaser to come to Friday night services. And the complaint is that the sermon topic gives the impression that the whole congregation is protesting what happened in Ferguson and in New York, and this congregant does not want to be represented that way. And not only that, the congregant says, but what about our temple member who is a member of the state police? How do you think he might feel if he sees that sermon topic up there? She hangs up and the president calls. So the president has gotten a complaint about the Facebook page, about the sites that the Facebook page links to, and what that might imply about the congregation. Now the rabbi doesn't know if it's the same person who's called both of them, and she's hoping it is, because if it's two different people, she's got a different problem on her hands. So now the rabbi is thinking she should be calling this police officer and checking things out with him to make sure, in fact, he's feeling connected, not feeling offended. But she had already reserved only an hour to make a number of other pastoral calls before Shabbat, and she's not going to have time to do both. Plus, she still has to write that sermon. Plus, she has to prepare for, the panel and the parent program and all the other things. Now, this is somebody who is actually pretty good. She would tell you she prides herself on practicing good self-care. She takes time for yoga. She's been to IJS. And then she gets a visit from a congregant who complains that the rabbi, in fact, is always on retreats taking care of herself, never giving enough back to the congregation. And she wants the rabbi, she's argued for this, to have drop-in hours on Fridays. She wants the rabbi to teach a meditation class on the one evening the rabbi has off during the week. The rabbi says whatever she does for this congregant never feels like it's enough. We all know congregants like that. And by the way, the congregant sits on the personnel committee and votes on the rabbi's contract, right? So I just tell these stories as a reminder of how quickly we have to switch emotional gears in the rabbinate. I once heard a New York area rabbi say that he had been to all 5 boroughs in one day because he'd done a wedding and he'd done a funeral, and how crazy that switching of gears can be. But I think the most important thing to take away from this is that we are all vulnerable. All of us who are rabbis, we are all vulnerable. Not just those of us who succumb to our urges and end up in the headlines. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It just means that we're human beings, that we haven't bought our own press here. And that we're going to have feelings and urges, and we have to learn how to manage those as part of our work. And enjoy the work. We want to enjoy the work. I think it's lovely to think that the bar mitzvah father in the earlier example is an adult who has equal responsibility in his relationship with the rabbi, but the truth is that it is always, and it is exclusively, the rabbinic responsibility to maintain the boundaries in these relationships for all the reasons that we know. It's our job always to relate appropriately despite whatever other temptations may be surrounding us. If you don't know who you are and what you feel, you can't be in healthy relationship with people. It's a basic premise of therapy that people don't know what they feel until they start to talk. That talking is what allows feelings to come to the surface, and then you can look at them, and then you can make good choices. So if you don't know what you feel, it's very hard to make good choices. Talking serves a lot of other purposes for rabbis, all of which are in the chapter, which you can read, not the least of which includes relieving stress and relieving the sense of isolation that so many rabbis experience. But fundamentally, talking has to be part of every rabbinate so that you can sort out the difference between what's me and what's not me. Those are not questions that we answer at one point for all time, because situations change and we change. And I remember before I left my last congregation in my last year there was something that came up. I don't even remember what the something was, but my reaction to it was, wow, I've been doing this work for over 30 years. This has never happened before. And I think congregational life particularly, but all rabbinates, are filled with situations where things come up that have never happened before. It doesn't matter how good our rabbinic training is, you just can't know all of these things in advance. But it is an argument for why, therefore, we have to keep ourselves in a talking situation all the way through our rabbinate so that we have a place when those things come up to be able to process them and to be prepared for anything.
Thank you. So, Rabbi Brown, you talk about something coming up that you had not been necessarily prepared for and early in your rabbinate, but thinking perhaps you should have already crossed this bridge or thought about it in rabbinical school. So if you could help us to understand the process that you went through on a personal level when something came up for you.
Thanks, Fredi. Thanks, Ellen. It's lovely to be able to share this panel with you. Thank you all for being here today. And I just want to acknowledge that there's a number of different colleagues in the room that have accompanied me on different parts of my journey. And it's a treat to sort of be in the room, to sort of be aware of that Rabbi Debbie Prinz was a senior colleague of mine in San Diego when we were both in pulpits there. And then we've had the chance to work together by way of continuing education opportunities at the CCAR. Rabbi Alan Henkin, sort of in the background of the story that I'm going to tell today in terms of the mentoring that he did for me during the placement process that brought me here to New York. Rabbi Herring, I was a part of the last cohort of the STAR peer professional learning opportunity for rabbis several years ago. And more recently that Leora Isaacs and Kate Lauser, through their connection with UJA of New York, have been just a tremendous source of learning and support of professional development, not only for me, but also for my congregation over the last year and a half. So, Chag Sameach. Heschel taught that we have to have more than textbooks, that we need text people. His assertion is useful as we re-engage once again around this question of what constitutes a meaningful rabbinic education today. Should the emphasis be on text learning and facility with our classical sources because that's where the historic authority of the rabbi is derived from? Or should the emphasis be on relational skills that will enable rabbis to become text people, clergy who can successfully mediate our tradition in a modernity that is constantly requiring us to meet people where they're at? Although I was raised in a Reformed Jewish home, it was not a foregone conclusion for me that I should study at Hebrew Union College. traditional modes of Jewish observance like Kashrut and Shabbat had spoken to me during my undergraduate years, so did a meaningful study experience at Pardes in Jerusalem, I actively considered JTS as a result. Nonetheless, I intentionally chose HUC not just for ideological purposes, but also because I believed that HUC had a rabbinic curriculum that meaningfully balanced the Heschelian scales, so to speak, between texts and text people. My 5 years at the college from 2000 to 2005, the first in Jerusalem and the subsequent 4 in Cincinnati, were filled with learning. They were pleasant and positive in every respect. I'm happy to be here today for no other reason than to be able to learn once again from Rabbi Marmer, who was a teacher of mine during that time. In retrospect, one of the few things that was missing from my HUC experience was an extended opportunity to delve into interfaith issues and the question of rabbinic officiation at a wedding in which one partner is not Jewish. I could not have articulated that gap in my learning when I was ordained in 2005, nor could I have done so during the first 6 years of my 7-year assistantship in San Diego. You can read my piece in the book to discover how a Reform rabbi could go that long without a position on such a pivotal question. It was only when I decided to seek out a solo position back here on the East Coast that the question really entered my consciousness. It very quickly demanded an answer. As it turns out, my future job prospects depended on it. On one foot, I decided to ignore virtually all of the advice that I received from friends, colleagues, and mentors. I chose instead to honestly tell congregations that I was interviewing with during the summer and fall of 2011 that I didn't know exactly how I felt about the officiation question, but that I envisioned spending my first year in a new position devoted to explicitly studying, teaching, and dialoguing with the congregation about it. It turned out to be an incredibly stupid and incredibly brilliant course of action. Stupid because at the time I had no appreciation for the emotional volatility that surrounds the interfaith issue, exponentially compounded by the volatility in my synagogue system as they transitioned from a rabbi of 31 years to the new guy. And yet brilliant because it enabled me to prove to the community that I was a rabbi who was interested in having candid, difficult conversations with them. It showed them that I was not afraid of a little controversy, and it showed them that I was intensely committed to listening to them and learning from them. I share all of this with you because I think that my story stands at the intersection of Heschel's text versus text people question. On the one hand, I accepted the invitation to be with you today because I believe that rabbinical students in school and newly ordained colleagues in the field are in need of a safe space to study and reflect on the texts surrounding this issue in a way that will allow them to move past the gut instinct articulation that we should be inclusive simply because of the notions of compassion and justice. My sense, by the way, is that anecdotally speaking, this is the basis for how my younger Reform colleagues approach this issue. Liberal rabbis may in fact be inclined to approach these Jewish legal questions with permissiveness. Indeed, I ultimately decided to do so to a certain degree. But our decision to do so should always be, in my opinion, rooted in the texts of our tradition. A rabbinic education around this issue today requires that this body of text be taught in a way that was not taught to me. And yet I also stand here today to affirm without reservation that I was successful in my own enterprise precisely because of the way in which HUC trained me as a text person, relationally speaking. Thanks in particular to my teacher, Rabbi Ruth Alpers, who supervised me through 600 hours and 1.5 units of clinical pastoral education. I have a set of relationship building skills, and I would add self-care skills as well, that enabled me to have this direct and difficult conversation with my congregation and to navigate all of the politics related to it. I suppose then that this is, of course, not an either-or enterprise. Rabbinic learning today must obviously be rooted in text, and it must be rooted in the notion of building and shaping text people so that our future colleagues are able to access the texts of our canon and so that they have the relational skills to bring them to the wider community. In light of the question that was raised earlier about how long the length of of rabbinic training is today and should be in the future. I would just say in the vernacular of Hanukkah that on reflection for me, it's a nes gadol that our programs manage to fit in all that they actually do in the 5 short years, so to speak, that we all sort of go on this journey together. So thanks for inviting me to share a little bit about my story.